I am so appreciative of Anita and Kathleen being with us today. We have wanted to provide information in addition to the information that we provide around guardianship and alternatives around supported decision making for quite some time, and we're just thrilled to have them here today. I'll let them tell you as much as they want to about themselves and what they do, but the basics is that Anita Raymond is the program director for the Volunteers of America Center for Excellence in Supported Decision Making. And I'm sure she does other things as well. And Kathleen is here because she's their lead social worker, and I believe takes a primary role on their guardianship information line, which many of you will be interested in learning about today. So I'm going to hand it off to them. We're going to hold questions until the end of the session, but please write them as you think of them. Just put them into the question box, and we'll be relaying those at the appropriate time. Thanks so much, and I'm turning it over to Anita.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Barb, for that warm welcome. And I especially want to thank our interpreter, and I really want to thank Jamie for all of their technical advice. We really appreciate that and need it, as we were just learning moments before we started. So thanks, everyone. I echo Barb's thanks and gratitude for the grace as we navigate technical issues. So on behalf of Kathleen and myself, we're really glad to be here, and we actually are not going to take more time talking about ourselves because we really want to share this information, and we've done pulled together a lot as it is in an hour that we could also present in 8 hours. So we want to jump right to it. We really are happy to be here today to discuss the promise of supported decision making and the transitions that families and individuals reach at the age of 18. Next slide, please. So today, this is what we're going to try to cover. Really, there are so many conversations that happen, and as we'll talk about, sort of the default in some conversations tends to be, you better get guardianship. And so we really want to spend a little bit of time at the beginning before we talk about supported decision making in talking about a little bit about the logistics, the legal side, and the benefits and a couple potential downsides of guardianship, and then edge into or change our focus to supported decision making. If we can skip the next slide, Jamie. That's kind of just a transition slide in every sense of the word, and go to the next. Oops, back one. There we go. Thank you. So if you were here this morning for Barb's excellent opening presentation, you heard about the changing role, and if you're living it, you know you're living the changing role of parents and families as young people turn 18. There's a lot of misinformation out there about the change in the legal and educational rights when the person turns 18. And again, too often there's that assumption, and even sometimes I would say an inaccurate insistence, that parents must seek guardianship because of these changes. Next slide, please. In one form or another, many parents hear all of these statements that are on the slide. Your doctor's not going to talk to you anymore. Everything's going to change when you're I say kid, and forgive me, that's not very professional, but when you're a young person, your kid turns 18, they're going to be taken advantage of. They're not independent. You can't participate anymore in their individualized education planning. Again, they're not independent. They can't access services. And so these messages come with good intention. But if you're like me, you look at that and that sounds pretty scary, and that sounds pretty intimidating and pretty overwhelming. And so it turns into this really subtle, and I guess I would even say not so subtle, pressure to seek guardianship, and to this idea that guardianship is the default, the standard, because of all these well-intended but often misinformed and fear-based notions, as well as really the idea we've all been living with about all these years about what it means to be independent. And we're really trying in our office, we talk a lot about that word, and I think Barb mentioned it this morning too, the really thinking differently, not independent, because frankly, how many of us anywhere are fully independent? I thought I was independent on getting myself to this meeting today and getting ready, and I'm not. It was well demonstrated I'm interdependent on Jamie, for example, walking me through. So we're all interdependent, but we get this idea that young people with disabilities aren't fully, completely capable of doing everything, and then therefore they must have a guardian. And that very language in the IDEA Act, the federal act, this, that language, all of the educational and due process rights provided to parents under IDEA transfer to the student when they reach the age of majority, unless they're under legal guardianship. True technically, right? That transfers to the student, but that doesn't mean, yet too often people interpret that means parents, you're out of the picture, family, whoever the supporter, you're out of the picture. Your child now has to stand alone or have a guardian. That it's this very binary choice. It's one or the other. And what we're trying to talk about today, and if we can go to the next slide, what we want to talk about today is getting away from that idea of it being a binary, one or the independent or guardian, and more the role of people as supporters, and how families can, in fact, as Barb talked about, enhance the self-determination of the person. In this slide, I really wanted to emphasize that for people without disabilities, graduation, college, jobs are all considered rites of passage. We've actually heard, though, some people refer to guardianship as a rite of passage for young people with disabilities. As we'll talk about today, guardianship, though well-intended and though necessary in some situations, also comes with significant loss of rights. And as I mentioned, unintended consequences for the student and also for you, the family and the supporters. And so we really, again, want to change that conversation. And the conversation is changing in Minnesota and nationally, the conversation about independence and interdependence and decision-making and guardianship. We want to emphasize, I don't want anyone to be squirming in their chair and worrying or feeling defensive. We are not saying guardianship is bad or is wrong or is not the right situation in many tools. It is one of many decision-making supports, many decision-making options. It may well be the very best tool in some situations. But let's not have it be a rite of passage. Let's not have it be that automatic default next step. And we recognize for many families who are already engaged in guardianship, it may very well be needed and may have been needed at the time it was established. But it's a good idea, and we hope this will provoke some conversation today in families that it's a good idea to reevaluate, has the situation that originally caused the need for guardianship, has that changed? Has the person gained more abilities? Are there now more options available? Maybe guardianship can now be modified, so some of the powers reduced and rights given back to the person, or maybe it can be terminated altogether in favor of other ways of supporting the person. So our point today is that even students who need significant help in their IEP meetings and other life transition planning and daily life skills and decisions, in and of itself needing help or not being independent, in and of itself does not point to the need for guardianship. There are countless opportunities to support people to ensure they have everything they need and want without involving the guardianship. If we can go to the next, I'll skip this transition slide because I'm going to talk about a few words about guardianship, and thank you. Jamie went right to the statute. So I just want to spend a couple moments on the statutory language so people understand what it is we're talking about when we're talking about guardianship. And Barb mentioned it sounds like PACER will offer future webinars that will delve deeper and spend more time on it. But just a couple things I want to frame the conversation with. The statutory language was modified as of August of 2020, such that it further strengthened an idea that had already been in place and made some additions. The statutory language now says that a person who is eligible for guardianship, or a person who's incapacitated under the guardianship definition, has to have an impairment, so the disability, an intellectual or developmental disability, for example, a diagnosis, they lack ability to make a decision, but that is never, ever enough. It's also, we have to show that they're unable to meet their personal needs for food, clothing, shelter, medical care, safety, supervision, even when we bring in technological assistance to help meet those needs, even when we bring in supporters to support people in decision making. We have to prove three things, and then we'll get to the next slide that talks about that: the disability, the unable to meet needs because of the disability, and that there are no less restrictive ways to address those needs of the individual. And the statute now defines, or not defines, but gives a list. It actually does define supported decision making, which I will get to a little later, but it lists examples of less restrictive approaches. If we can connect a person, if they need to move into a setting that is maybe has more wraparound services, if they need some supports where they're currently living in their own home or their own apartment or a family home, if they can appoint somebody to help them with medical decision making through a healthcare directive. These are examples that the statute, this is not an inclusive list, but examples that the statute provides of these are the things we need to try. And that actually has to be listed on the petition now. That was new. You have to list on the petition what less restrictive alternatives were tried, for how long, why they didn't work. And then you have to prove it in the court hearing, and then the court has to make specific findings in their order appointing. Next slide, please. This next slide is probably going to cause several questions and concerns if this is the first you're hearing of it. And again, I'm not going to spend more time on it, but you can reach out to us on the guardianship information line, or we'll try to hit it at the end today if people have questions. But this is another brand new piece. Effective August of 2020, any guardianships that were put in place as of August 2020, now for a person younger than 30, automatically end after 72 months. Again, that's a new piece in the statute. That is reflective of the idea that everyone's brains, with disability or not having a disability, brains continue to grow and develop. We know this. And so, or maybe at 18, somebody is really resistive to having family help and others help support them in decision making, and they're in grave danger and can't make the decision. So maybe guardianship is necessary then. But within 72 months, maybe the person is more able and willing and has gained more skills, which we hope would be what was happening during the 72 months of the guardianship, is working towards eventual end of the guardianship. And then if a person still needs guardianship after that 72 months, that's okay. Just another petition has to be filed, and then one more, depending on when the whole process started, until they're 30, and then the guardianship will be, for good or bad, will be permanent unless the court specified otherwise, or an action is taken to reduce to end or terminate or modify the guardianship. The next two slides, Jamie, we're not going to spend time on, other than it would be incomplete to tell you about guardianship without also just giving you a brief skim of conservatorship. So conservatorship is the other side of the coin. Guardianship is decision-making authority over personal, like body kinds of decisions, if I may, and then conservatorship is court-appointed decision-making authority over money, assets, etc. Most of the people that you're supporting, young folks who are, just turning 18, maybe will have some employment earnings, which according to statute, they keep managing themselves anyway, unless a conservatorship order says otherwise. So they manage their own earnings anyway, and if they only have, for example, supplemental security income, that can be managed by a representative payee. And so conservatorship really isn't needed very often in situations of young people just turning 18. Next slides, please. The really important thing we want people to take away with the question of should I seek guardianship or not is the eligibility criteria we just talked about, but also, can the guardianship accomplish what you want it to accomplish? That's a key piece. It's really a consent power. It's a paper power. Yes, you walk away with a piece of paper that says you have legal decision-making authority in various areas, but there's nothing magical about that authority to get the young person to do the thing we want them to do that they don't want to do, or vice versa, to get them to stop doing what we think as a dangerous behavior. Even the consent to, for example, making a decision about where they live. If they refuse to go physically go, the guardian can say, you have to go because I said so, but how do we actually get them there? It's not a guardianship authority. It's a communication style. It's working with the individual. So that's an important piece we want people to really take away as they're contemplating guardianship. Next slide, please. It's also an adversarial process. If we go back one, there we go, perfect. It might not feel adversarial. Lots of times we recognize young people are told, you know, do you want your parents to keep helping you as the way they have been? Sure, I do. Okay, and then let's go seek the guardianship hearing. Let's file a petition and go to the hearing. And it doesn't feel adversarial to the individual, but at its essence, at its core, it's by necessity, it is a focus on the deficits of the individual. It is a court process, which can feel scary. It is a process that protects due process rights of an individual, because the scope of it is we are removing civil rights to make decisions about what happens to a person. So within that, the process has a lot of protections built in, which can feel traumatic, overwhelming, time-consuming. Again, topic for a much longer discussion can happen. Next slide, please. So we really are recognizing, again, in Minnesota, DHS, special education, across the board, nationally, internationally, a recognition that guardianship has historically been overused. Again, please, we're not saying anybody is bad or made bad choices to seek guardianship at the time. It's just something we know now is not, we know now there are more options. We know now there are more unintended consequences. We have a little pill bottle icon on this slide, and that's to remind me to help our colleague John Kantke, who's an attorney at Volunteers of America that works with us a lot, came up with I think a really helpful metaphor. If you think about a medication for, say, heart failure, if we think about a medication that we've just kind of, the medical system, it's been around for 50 years, we've sort of always used it, right? And then all of a sudden one day, maybe your parent is on that medicine or you are, and one day we wake up and we listen to the news or read the paper, and suddenly now we know that that particular medication comes with significant dangerous side effects that we didn't know about before. So now we think differently of, oh, now that we know that medication is still effective for the heart failure, but it comes with serious side effects. So we want to think carefully, should we try a different intervention instead of that particular medication? And maybe we can accomplish the same thing of addressing the need, but in a less dangerous way, or a less full of side effects, if I may. So that's kind of how we want to think about it. Not necessarily somebody is bad if they sought guardianship in the past, but we just know more now than we did then when the statutes were first developed in Minnesota and the whole concept of guardianship came into being a few hundred years ago. We recognize guardianship can promote a false sense of security. And again, as I alluded to a minute ago, that guardianship just plain can't solve all the problems we want it to solve. Next slides, please. So this is an opportunity. This is where we want to acknowledge that there are new ways of thinking about supporting people and their vulnerabilities, new ways to think about people who do need help and aren't wholly independent, but may not need a guardianship, when we can support them in other ways of accessing care and services. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Anita. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. And I'm sorry, attendees, if you'll bear with me, I am at the tail end of a cold, so you may see me sipping my tea and hoping I don't start coughing. So I will dive in here to talking a little bit more about supported decision making. As you'll see on the slide here, and we reference an emerging approach. It's something that, you know, parents have asked me, like, is this a thing? Have you done this? Does this actually work? And the answer is yes. You know, systems change takes time, and it is something that 5 years ago when I joined this office was a brand new thing to us here in Minnesota. How do we formalize this? What is this going to look like for people? And as we'll talk about in the slides going forward, it looks a little different for each person, depending on what they need, what they want, the kind of supports they have, etc. So just really looking at, shifting from that ultimate protection of guardianship, the only thing we had in our toolbox, to looking at acknowledging the strengths of a person and also their need for support and how we can build on that. Acknowledging, you know, there can still be a safety net. There are still ways to address some of the issues, the worries, the concerns that maybe, you know, we as professionals or you as a parent have about a person's current or future situation. Just being able to support them without completely removing rights through a guardianship. So looking at that balance, and like Anita talked about earlier, interdependence, as opposed to expecting, you know, they can't do that completely 100% on their own, therefore it's just not an option. Next slide, please. So I won't read this to you, but this is just some language for you. And as Anita already talked about, there was a change to our guardianship statute in August of 2020. And so I say, even the law now recognizes supported decision-making as an option, and really requires that less restrictive alternatives be explored before going toward guardianship. And as Anita already talked about, explaining why they didn't work. This is definitely something that needs to be a strong consideration, not just saying, nope, it didn't work, but did you actually try it? Or are there actual reasons, you know, for your situation why it just absolutely wasn't an option? In future slides here, I'll be talking a little bit about this tool that we reference around supported decision making. And we have other trainings that are very in-depth about what are all of these alternatives, how do they work, might they apply to a person's situation. But you know, we can touch on that a little bit later as well. And again, our guardianship information line, which is in the chat here, and our resource slides, we're always able to talk through those situations with people and what supports might exist as well. And then, yes, next slide. We're just talking about this again as like a paradigm shift and not defaulting to guardianship as this ultimate protection, rather looking at the person, their dignity, their autonomy, what's important to them, and looking at supported decision making, as Jonathan Martinez says, as human decision making. Yes, there are things in my day-to-day that I don't need help with. I don't need you to tell me whether I should make my own coffee or go pick up coffee. I can decide that on my own. But you know, there are other things that I might need help with, and they might seem silly to some people. But since I'm in a position where I can say, this is what I need, I can advocate for myself. Those are just things that we're looking at, and like, how do we all make decisions, and how does that type of decision making apply to the young people that we're looking at supporting here. And then these are just some quotes that we have here just about, it's just a fancy way of describing how we all make decisions. I just talked about that. You can do the next slide, please. And there's a lot of information if you wanted to look up on your own about Jenny Hatch and her situation, but this is one of those success stories that early on here in the United States, her story really stands out as a really good example of supported decision making. And it doesn't mean that we all back out entirely, parents just disappear and the person does everything on their own. It's a different way of supporting and a different role of support. On the next slide here, this is the tool that I was referencing, and this is a nice infographic, and this is the handout that y'all would have received, been able to view along with our presentation. And this is something that was created, I believe, back in 2014, 2016. Just that really kind of lays out supported decision making, and excuse me, just a great graphic to kind of explain this new concept. Might be new to you still, because it is newer to many professionals as well, and there often is still that default to just go for guardianship. So this can be a really great way for you as a supporter of a young person, or even like Barb had talked about, you know, helping make sense of this for other parents, maybe in similar situations, bringing it to the school or other team meetings to say, let's look at this together. Let's apply this to this person's situation and see how we might be able to apply it, how it might help kind of think through different kinds of supports. Next slide, please. This just looking at really emphasizing maybe this last bullet point, and they are all important, but for the sake of time, not talking through each and every point, supported decision making is empowering a person's skill building and decision making. So whether someone has a specific diagnosis or not, absolutely that's important. There are some markers, trends, things we know we maybe expect with a certain diagnosis, but those are also often many times on a spectrum. And even if not, it's still, how does that apply to the person? So whether we get calls about an older adult with memory impairment issues or a younger person with autism, that is definitely important to know, definitely relevant, but just pump the brakes for a second and tell me more. Like, how does autism impact this person's life? What strengths do they have? What areas are you worried about, etc. And really talking through that. Next slide, please. So what happens now, or what has been happening up until the last couple of years as supported decision making has started to gain momentum, has been, like we've already said, that default to guardianship. And once there's a guardianship in place, there is often this bias toward just defaulting to the guardian, and the person gets a little bit lost in that guardianship. And that's by maybe no fault of anyone's, except for oftentimes our systems, right? Like they'll see there's a guardian and therefore that is the person who's contacted. And for ease of communication, oftentimes guardian will say yes, no, and just kind of go on about it instead of saying, well, let me go back to, my son, my daughter, etc., talk to them about it, come up with a plan, get back to you. And ultimately the guardian does have that control. They have the ability to just consent yes or no. But there's little emphasis on that teaching decision-making skills in many of these situations. Next slide. So we're just looking at rethinking support. How do all people become good decision makers? We probably all have some embarrassing stories in our life of when I was younger, I did this thing and oh my goodness, that was a bad idea. Or my mom or dad told me not to do things this way and I did it anyway. And hopefully we learned from it. And I laugh, but I do understand too, there are some barriers to folks that have different diagnoses that, parents are concerned, but they're never going to learn. They're never going to retain the ability to learn from those mistakes. And that might be the case. But also it's are there certain kinds of decisions they can make that are maybe a little bit less risky, that they can kind of try, maybe fail a little bit without, putting themselves or anyone else at serious risk, instead of just bubble wrapping them and saying like, it's just going to be best for them, right? Like they're going to have the least amount of like stress and de-stress if we just kind of decide for them. We really want to look at what support could look like for that person and try to help them through those life situations. I think just we talk about this in our office, both personally and professionally, like how do we get comfortable with ambiguity? And during the pandemic, especially like in the depths of it, it was like, oh, here's a practice in being comfortable with ambiguity, right? Like there was so much unknown and there was so much that we couldn't control. That was really hard. And so as a parent, when you're looking at this person who you've supported and raised to, 16, 17, 20, however old they are, it can be really hard to sit in that place of like, I don't know what's going to happen. And they might make a choice that I'm really worried about. But again, also looking at how can you support them in understanding the choices that they're making so they can make a good choice for themselves. It might not be the choice that we would necessarily pick, but if there's communication and support around that, it can be, for many people, that can be a successful approach. Next slide, providing support. So things, as we were talking about, and this conference is a perfect example of the resources in our toolbox, right? And the other ways that we or you as parents can find support, kind of leaning into organizations like PACER, Proof, Disability Hub, etc. There's too many to name, but really looking at, who can you lean into for support in the role that you're in, supporting that person, and also looking at what kind of supports they themselves need directly, whether it's, you know, the college program that they were talking about earlier that can be a support for folks, ILS, job coaches, etc. There can be a lot of people. It can be really resource intensive, and we fully recognize, you know, especially in other further out parts of the state, maybe there may be even more limitations to support than there are in the metro. Of course, like there's all these issues with not having staff, and it's getting tough for folks to build in some of those supports we do talk about. So maybe idealizing it just a tiny bit, but also recognizing like the reality. Sometimes it can be hard to do supported decision making and to provide these supports we're talking about. It can feel like it's all on you as the individual supporter. And I really hope, you know, and if it does feel like that, call us. We don't have a magic wand, but we're there to really delve into the situation and try to problem solve a lot of these scenarios that come up. Looking at also being flexible and trying multiple ways. It can feel really tiring to do supported decision making. It is. I mean, when there are multiple conversations with someone about like, okay, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about this again. And it is okay for you to change your mind. But at the same time, you know, there can be a lot of back and forth. And again, if you're talking about limited resources with like county supports, et cetera, that can get a little tricky. But really just looking at the flexibility and trying different ways that would make sense for the person. You know the person that you're supporting really well, and just trying to explore that. And sometimes you might feel like you're too far in the weeds, like it's just not working, I don't know how to do this. And again, we are one of the resources that's out there to kind of talk through it, maybe give you some next steps of things to try. Next slide, please. And as we talked about already, what can you do? You know, acknowledging decision making is a basic human right. It's a natural part of the human experience. Considering that what we want for someone else may not be what they determine is best for them, or they might not be fully understanding all the decisions, right? So like trying to break it down in a way that makes sense, maybe just little bits of information at a time, as opposed to, you know, dumping all of these options on them, putting things in writing, etc. I mean, it can just be, you know, people that you need some time to think about it. These can be complicated decisions. How am I supposed to decide if I just want to start working, or do I want to go to college when I'm done with this program? That's a big choice, you know? So how can we talk through supporting those choices? Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. I think we talked about this already, so I'll just kind of move on possibly to the next one, but just talking about what can you do. And I think I kind of jumped ahead of myself there, but there are different things you can do. And again, leaning into those resources that are available, or at least starting the conversation, you know, even if you're the person you're supporting maybe isn't close to 17, 18 yet, or you have a younger kiddo who you're thinking about too, but it can really help to kind of look at, you know, what's coming down the line and kind of anticipating ways that they might need support as well. And then just saying, you know what, a lot of times we're like, hey, I think we might already be doing supported decision making. We might not be calling it that. But if you go to the next slide, or yes, thank you, this slide you're on currently, the supported decision making example of managing money. We get a lot of calls of like, this person, they can't even count change. Like they definitely need a guardianship. We're so worried they're going to be taken advantage of. Absolutely, we get that concern for sure. However, that might not even be addressed in guardianship, and it isn't really, but other than the contract authority perhaps. But looking at the supported decision-making brainstorming guide, this is an example from that. And it's just sitting down with the person and really conceptualizing, okay, here are all these areas of your life. For example, managing money. If nobody talks to the person about it, they do it completely independently. There's no communication there. That's not supported decision making. But if you're maybe sitting down with a person and saying, okay, you just got a job now at Coburn's, you know, let's maybe open a bank account. Would you like me or mom or dad or someone else to be on the account with you? We can kind of keep track of it together, make sure, you know, you're tracking all your spending, etc. So anything along those lines is supported decision making. It can be simple, it can be a little bit more complex, especially if you go to the next slide, please, with healthcare decisions. Of course, there's a whole other conversation, right? And it could be a whole other entire presentation about how to support a person in making those complex healthcare decisions. And that's where possibly doing some other kinds of supports like a healthcare directive could come into place as well. You can skip to the next slide, please. And that's just another example, deciding where to live. You know, we talk about that, like, do you need to be on a bus line? Does Metro Mobility come there? Do you want to be close to work or close to family, et cetera? Just really sitting down and kind of supporting the person if they need that kind of conversation to decide, you know, how do I decide this? This is hard to decide.
So we know, and I referenced this at the beginning, we know not everyone is a great candidate for supported decision making, that some people absolutely will need that level of protection and growth, time to grow and learn that comes in skill building that may accompany guardianship. So not everybody's a candidate, but a lot of people are. Next slide, please. So again, less about the disability, less about the day-to-day functioning, less about the diagnosis or the severity of a diagnosis, comes down to if the person can recognize, if your kiddo can recognize, yeah, it's been kind of nice all these years, mom and dad helping me. Maybe it's many. I'm 18, I'm out of here. I'm getting my tattoo in my car and I'm done. Okay, but lots of folks, depending on how we have that conversation and how we're supporting, if it's not being set up as you know, it's not being set up as a sort of an antagonistic thing. People recognizing they want the help and we're here to help support them instead of telling them what to do, but working together, making decisions with them instead of for them. So they're open to that help. They do have you in their lives or someone else in their, many others, someone else's in their life to help form a team. Ideally, we would want to think about documents such as a healthcare directive or a power of attorney or a trust if they do have or will be inheriting money, so that down the road, if something should happen to them, like could happen to any of us, where we're suddenly by illness or accident can't make our own decisions at all, then we will have put in place an advanced planning tool like a healthcare directive or a power of attorney or trust that someone then, when we are fully unable or when our kiddo happens they're fully unable, someone can step in and act for them. So that's an important planning piece to go with that. But short of someone else making decisions for, it's about making decisions with and having that kind of relationship and communication with the young person that they're okay with you remaining involved and supporting them. Again, in no way do we expect that 18, no guardianship and also no support. All right, that's a common misconception, so I keep emphasizing it. If we can go to the next slide, and sort of to contrast that, yep, the kind of people who still might need a guardianship would be somebody for whom, because of their disability, because of that impaired thinking, that they truly can't recognize their vulnerabilities, and we can't overcome, we can't build in support systems, we can't overcome their refusal and their resistance to having us continue supporting them. They sabotage everything we try to do, and they're truly, by any definition, incredibly imminent harm, you know, very risky to leave them to have the legal authority themselves to make decisions. There's no supporters, or the supporters truly aren't able to be supportive. It's really, they're just that constant conflict. So these are the folks for whom perhaps supported decision making isn't going to work, or at least not right now. Supported decision making isn't going to work. Thank you, Jamie, for reading my mind. Isn't Jamie fantastic? Ready for this slide. So the objection or the concern we hear is, but isn't guardianship required? Because people think it is. It's so ingrained. And in fact, we're here to say it is not. And in fact, guardianship law, as we just shared with you, says if a person can be supported, we can't get guardianship. And therefore, we aren't able to petition for or obtain guardianship when we can connect the person with services in any other way. So it's not mandated. If you hear somebody telling you you must have guardianship in order to continue participating in the IEP, in order to receive county services, in order to move to an ILS or semi-independent living situation, if you are being told it's required, please call us, consider calling an ombudsman and advocate. That is actually a violation of several state and federal law as well as state policy. Next slide, please. But we know, you hear this. Parents get told that you can't be involved anymore in talking to the doctor. Again, we've covered a lot of these. My adult child will get taken advantage of, make bad decisions. And the thing we want to sort through is piece by piece. Yes, that is a very real concern. Absolutely. And what can we do to overcome that? A doctor won't talk to you without guardianship. Well, a doctor will talk to you if your kiddo says, yeah, it's fine. And better yet, if we have, go to ask that health system, where's your release of information? Or you can get a standard release of information. Doctors, clinics, health systems tend to prefer we use their forms, but that's not mandatory either. But have your kiddo sign a release of information that says, yep, you can talk to mom, dad, brother, sister, but not that friend, not grandpa. You know, whatever is appropriate to that situation. They might get taken advantage of. Very real concern, absolutely. So what can we do to help build up skills? What can we do? They might get taken advantage of in what way? Somebody talks them out of all of their money every time they get their SSI every month. Okay. That's true, and they have a hard time saying no. Well, then maybe a representative payee, and maybe budgeting training and skill building, and in the meantime, the representative payee or an authorized signer on the bank account, if the wages go in there, I'm gonna, by agreement with my kiddo, $100 a month for you to spend however you want, and then the rest is protected. Recognizing what does it mean to be taken advantage of. Sometimes we hear, well, my kiddo wants to give all their candy, whatever it is that's valuable to them, their Pokemon cards, whatever that might be, give them all away every time they turn around. Well, that looks like being taken advantage of to us, but to the young person, what it looks like is this is a give and take in friendship. I give things away and my friends give me things. So thinking carefully how we're labeling and how realistic. They might make bad decisions. Again, Kathleen referenced earlier, super dire decisions that have imminent, likely, foreseeable, significant harm. Yeah, we want to find ways to protect that. Can a guardian even stop some of that? As we said earlier, maybe not. And with or without a guardian, what can we do to help reduce the risks? Not eliminate. What's a reasonable amount of risk that still enhances that person's sense of self and the dignity of risk and feeling like they're still a person, a human being in charge of getting to make decisions the way we all enjoy. And by the way, and Kathleen mentioned it earlier, raise your hand. I won't be able to see you, but raise your hand if you've never made a bad decision. And when you've made a bad decision, did you learn from it? I learned from my bad decisions. I learned do I wish I hadn't made some of the decisions I made in my life? Yes and no, because I learned from them. And then I learned what was important to me. And so we want to, if we bubble wrap people, and that was referenced in one of the slides on that graphic Kathleen was talking about, sometimes if we eliminate any ability to make decisions at all, we are also keeping somebody dependent, keeping somebody in a box where they never learn to make decisions. Next slide, please. So again, moving from you can't, your disability prevents you, to maybe you can, let's figure out how. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of decision-making, supported decision-making resources out there, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go a little quickly through these because we want to have a little wrap-up and then some time for Q&A. So next slide, please, on the brainstorming guide. Kathleen mentioned this already. I really like this tool, and as it says here, I'm sorry, the next slide, please. It can help you just really think through ways, as we already showed on some previous slides from this same guide, think through ways you're already using supported decision-making that's perfectly appropriate and perfectly feasible, and think about new ways, if we can go to the next, think about new ways to do it. So I encourage you, and we've given you a link in the end of the slides, to look to some of these resources. The brainstorming guide is sort of a list of what are we already doing with some prompts like we saw in in the slides, and what are some other ways we could do. And then moving on to this next tool that we like to promote, how to make a supported decision-making agreement. And Jamie just is showing you the table of contents here. I know it's kind of hard to read. What I'm hoping these slides do is pique your interest so that you go take a peek at it. Whereas the brainstorming guide is aimed at families, this how to make a supported decision-making agreement is aimed at the person. You want to go to the next slide, Jamie. Again, I'm not going to go slide by slide, but I just like to take a few screenshots from this guide to show you how it works. So it really just walks you and your young person through thinking about choices that you have to make, how you made them, how they didn't go well, did go well, to really get people, again, brainstorming, if we can overuse that word, to really get people brainstorming about how we might approach this. Next slide, please. Chapter 3 is my favorite chapter of this book. It's a pretty long, it's a booklet, like something like 28 pages or so. My favorite part is when we think about support, and this gives examples of some really tangible ways that we might already be using or that we hadn't thought about, like, oh, my kiddo can't make a complicated medical decision and they have some pretty complex medical needs. Well, wait a minute. If when they were 15, 16, 17 and we came home from that medical appointment or the hospitalization and they said, what was all that? What was happening? I don't understand. And we said in plain language, well, you needed an operation because it was an emergency appendectomy. You needed an operation because your stomach was really hurting badly. And so we gave the doctor permission to operate so you could get better. That kind of language can continue into young adulthood. And I recognize I oversimplified there, but using those kinds, using pictures, learning about different choices. On the next slide, they might get lost, they can't make it to school or their job on their own, so they have to have a guardian. Well, maybe not. Maybe we can use trials together. We can visit together. I know Kathleen's little guy just started kindergarten this year, and there were lots of trials. They went to the school together and they looked at the classroom, and this is what it's going to be like a bus. And in no way am I equating an 17, 18-year-old who has disabilities with a child, but the example is similar, that the way we have done with our kiddos their whole lifespan, explaining trials, making pros and con lists, the kinds of things that are available that we just might not think about to help support a person to be able to make better decisions or make decisions together. Next slide, please. Barb mentioned this morning our smartphones. Some of us are really worried about giving our young teens, young middle schoolers, teenagers, young adults with disabilities a smartphone. Look what can happen. Vulnerabilities, yes, but there are things we can build in to address vulnerabilities and look at what incredible devices they are to do reminders to call mom and check in, reminders to take a medicine, a map if we get disoriented or turned around, build in a Lyft or Uber app that they need a ride back because they're in an unsafe situation and they can't figure it out. So just using the incredible tool available to us on a cell phone. Next slide, please. The next several slides, if you're following in your handout, and we'll have Jamie go through them fairly quickly, but this next set of slides are all the same theme. There's different tools and different language and different formatting, but the Missouri Guardianship Stoplight tool was sort of the first one. And again, in other slides that we have in your handout are just slightly different versions of the same thing, but what it does is encourages you to walk through with the person with the disability areas of sorting through. So as we're sorting out, might we need a guardian, or I just don't even know where to begin. I feel like they need help everywhere, in every domain. These kinds of tools really help break it down to what's the particular decision or need. Can they do it all by themselves? They need a little help, or they need total help. And even if there's a lot of check boxes on the far right of they need total help, that doesn't necessarily mean, oh, that means we have to have a guardian. That means that's an opportunity for us to think more about more skill building, more services and resources. Jamie's making sure I move through my slides, so thank you. And then another resource available is us. The Guardianship Information Line is a free statewide resource, in-depth consultation, phone, email, on these particular and issues that you're dealing with. So I'm going to turn it back to Kathleen because Kathleen's coughing. If Kathleen's ready, I'm going to turn it back to her to kind of bring us all home on the next slide. Jamie, we have a transition in summary, and then the next slide for Kathleen to hit it home for us.
Thanks, Anita, for recognizing that. I am coughing a little bit here. And I do want to spend time summarizing, but I'm also concerned because it's like 6 after at this point, and I want to check in and see if people have questions that we could answer. But just kind of reminding folks about supported decision making, and it's possible that you've been using these elements to support this person, you know, for years now, and just kind of looking at it, like Anita said, like how can we keep supporting them? And technology is really cool, and there are things I don't even know about at this point that can really help support a person. So I guess in summary, Anita, if there's anything to add to that, go for it. I feel a little rushed because I want to make sure we answer questions if we have any.
So just super quickly, thank you. And there's Barb to tell us, and yet we keep talking. Next slide, Jamie, just a quick reminder. So there's a lot of papers that you already have to file you have to mess with. Barb talked about it earlier, and I was feeling overwhelmed as she was saying it. So the good news is not doing a guardianship is a little less paperwork. There's a better chance, frankly, of preserving the relationship, because again, it's that decision-making with instead of imposing on. It's actually less expensive to society. We know by research and anecdote, we have better outcomes for the person. We can accomplish a lot with supporting them and making decisions with them that otherwise people used to think had to be accomplished in guardianship. And again, required by law to do less restrictive alternatives. And then just the last slide is just a reminder that there's so many benefits, and we can address safety and vulnerability concerns. And by the way, if we try it without guardianship and we need guardianship later, we can still go for guardianship. That's still an option. All right, Barb, we're going to stop talking and let you jump in. The last slide is, here we are.
Okay, well, the main reason I don't want you to stop talking, I could do fully another hour, and appreciate so much how valuable this information is. I would think that even if you're on this call and you already have established guardianship, there are so many tips for working more appropriately with our young adults to help them build skills for the future. And so I just so appreciate it. My concern is that we have, I would say, 4 or 5 really good questions. We have very smart parents who come to these workshops with very good questions. 2 have short answers. 2, though, I think really kind of express the reality of what people who are considering this kind of bump up against. And I know you covered this in general, but I thought this question I'm going to ask because this wasn't covered specifically. But this person says their child's disability actually creates the thought that he doesn't need any help on anything, and when he obviously does. And so according to everyone, that's according to everyone, not just us, we and our counselors have not been able to get past this. Is there someone or a resource who's kind of an expert in this to talk with him to help him understand that there are some areas he needs help with? He won't accept this from us, his parents, which is not an uncommon thing I hear. So far, schools and counselors haven't helped him to have this awareness, and it is the barrier of his disability. So is there someone else besides the parent who could be the point person for supported decision making? What happens then, and I get this a lot, what happens when I die? I'm juggling all this now, all these various components. Yeah. I'm not going to be there forever. How do I work myself out of that job?
Right.
Good question.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen.
No, I was just going to say that those are good questions and really, really valid, and something that we hear fairly often from folks. So just acknowledging, you know, you're not alone in those questions, and we will answer parts of that as well. But I did want to say, you'll see in your slides on slide 60 that we have a virtual guardianship information clinic. You don't have to wait. That's just once a month. You don't have to wait until then, but you may join us at one of those clinics. You can sign up for that and then virtually meet with myself, our other teammate Alicia, our guardianship information line specialist, Anita, and then John Kankey, an attorney with the state and elder law offices. We're all there, and we'll do breakout rooms, and we'll delve into these situations and really help support people to talk through. You know, if there are a few, like if you and the young person wanted to attend together, or if the you know, in the situation we're talking about, if their son wanted to just jump on and be like, my parents won't leave me alone about all my decisions and I want to talk to somebody because I think I'm right and they're wrong, you know, we can kind of start some of that conversation as well. And also via, you know, our guardianship info line. And I feel like in answering some of what you asked, Barb, I'm probably preaching to the choir with it, but I think a little bit about like advocates. And I don't know if ARC advocates are an option for this individual, but either that or potentially the Office of Ombudsman to get involved with the person to talk, just to listen to them and what they're wanting and then advocate, try to bridge some of those gaps. Because sometimes that resistiveness is just, it's my parents saying it. Therefore, I cannot hear what they're telling me because it is my parent and I am 18 and I don't want, you know, I don't want to understand or listen. So in a lot of those situations, we'll just try to delve in and figure out other people that they might listen to. Do they have a sibling, a cousin, or friend? You know, maybe kind of get at the conversation to loop around. Go ahead, Anita.
Another tool our colleague Alicia always reminds us is a person-centered planning process can go a long way. Sitting down, connecting with a certified trained person-centered planner, I don't know if they have to be certified, but who has those skills and that can really, again, if that person, and parent, you're right on, who asked the question, it's about maybe somebody else, maybe, hopefully, they'll listen when someone else approaches it. And when they feel that all the eyes are on them, like this is me, I'm at the center of this, not just my parents telling me what they think I should do. So a lot of great resources there. Planning for the future, what's going to happen? Real concern. I'm sorry, Barb, you're going to tell us we have to stop talking?
Well, we have 1 minute.
Okay.
So I did want to say this to those parents who asked their very good questions. One about limited guardianship still being an option. One about what if it's an out-of-town emergency for someone who has high healthcare needs. Another one about what about on the receiving end if the school personnel, in this case, their son was saying he's homeless because he really wants to get an apartment and the family isn't ready for that yet. And then how do you handle those disagreements? Would you say all of those are issues that those individual families could call the guardianship information line about and get additional information?
We would say that absolutely. And we would say that any one of those descriptions, guardianship may help, but may not help. And yep, we're absolutely happy to talk through. And the future planning, whether you're a guardian or a parent without guardianship authority, same thing, got to get creative and think ahead. And that's stressful and we're here to help. So thank you.
And again, if you are a PACER connected parent already, and you get confused after this about how to get in touch with our presenters and the resources that they can provide, feel free to contact us and we will make the appropriate referrals. Before we go, if we were in person, I would want to ask the audience to express appreciation. I know I'm a parent myself. This gives us so much to consider and think about. And again, PACER is all about high expectations and opportunities. At the same time, we recognize the very important role of families. And so together we're hoping to come to good conclusions about what will really serve the ones that we love in the best way possible, not only for the immediate, but for their long-term future. So thank you, Anita. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you.